Welcome. This will be my video on the 2002 TV movie The Rosa Parks Story, or the original title Ride to Freedom, The Rosa Parks Story. I'm going to start with a spoiler-free review, and then once I've completed that, get into what I call the thought section, where I discuss in spoiler detail. So I really was very, very relieved when I found that this was available to stream. I was not sure that I would be able to do it since, it is now Black History Month, and this is a movie I watched 20 years ago, I think, yeah, and back then it was just on TV. Haven't watched it since. I'm not sure I watched it more than the one time, and it's never really fully left, my mind. And yeah, I I want to start by making it clear that I am not trying to center myself, and every bit of analysis I'm going to do in this video is going to be based on black voices, primarily leftists, particularly the far left. I've learned a lot from them, here on YouTube. In fact, I wanted to make sure to recommend, if you haven't already watched, let's see, yes, 6 days ago now, Rebecca Azor made a video called Like It or Not, Accountability Doesn't Exist for ICE. Fantastic discussion. Yeah, very strongly recommended. I guess at this point I don't even really have to say, yeah, I love this movie. I'm not gonna pretend like there's nothing at all that, I will discuss, there are certain shortcomings. The movie is rated TV PG. I intend to try to keep this video that as well. It is possible I will detail some aspects of Jim Crow and racism in America in general that go beyond that. I'm also genuinely impressed that they did get away with the TV PG, but yeah, there are certain things that are just vague enough, just enough in the background, sometimes literally, that they were able to do so. I suppose that is one thing yeah, I think I'll discuss later in the video, but certainly this is a movie that, I think it's very difficult to make something that properly explores such intense racism, systemic racism, legalized racism, without going for bare minimum PG-13 or TV-14 in this case. Honestly, probably R, or I guess TVMA is the TV version of that. I also do want to make it clear I am not pretending to be an expert on Rosa Parks. I have, there are certain things I know, and I will base this video on them and the movie. Please do not take this video as a definitive, historical kind of, I'll try to, yeah, so some of what I'm saying in this video refers to the movie. I appreciate that there are things that they changed for it to make it fit, Yes, so let's start with the writing. So this is, I probably don't have to tell you who Rosa Parks is. One thing I really appreciate about this movie is that it pushes back against some of the myths surrounding her. The movie makes it abundantly clear she wasn't just like physically tired. It wasn't just like, no, she participated in the NAACP. She worked for them as a secretary and, yeah, wanted to fight for fairness. And, that is a very important thing to push back against this. That I've seen so many people who, on either side of it, some people who support her, some people who don't, yeah, repeat that myth. It can be difficult to get the truth out when it's someone so discussed, the subject of a lot of discussion, and when so many people wish she hadn't done it. The movie does, to an extent, do the biography, biopic thing on account of aspects such as its running time and the the fact that this was, important part, but only part of the overall civil rights movement. Yeah, this chooses to it speed runs some of her early life to set up later things, and then focuses very much on the her the bus situation. I guess I'm trying to keep it vague since I said I wasn't gonna spoil in the review itself. I mean, if you don't already know, I don't know. Anyway, moving on. I think one thing it would have benefited from was if it did try to include at least slightly more of the overall. It's not only about that, but it is focused primarily on that. So there's some stuff that is mentioned but not gone into in great detail. That is one thing I will definitely say. This is a movie that encourages you to look further into it. It was made after the internet, became a thing. So I don't know. I suppose it might have been somewhat limited what you could get of information back then, but I don't know. Books were also an option, and yeah, as already mentioned, it does try to fit into, there is a little bit of like the Hollywood mold going on, and I think that pretty much covers. Yeah, so the psychological accuracy is quite good. You really feel like you understand why Rosa did what she did, as well as like we meet a number of African American characters in this, many of them based on the real people, and yeah, like you understand where they're coming from. They are not always 100% in agreement on what to do, though they are, there is a tendency among them to appreciate how bad things are. And I suppose I might as well come out and say, no, it is not accidental that I do this, as ICE is making news in all the worst ways. Now, the authenticity is also quite impressive. Some of this was, at least some of this, I'm not 100% sure if it was, the full extent, but it was shot in Montgomery, Alabama, where the actual, so that adds a lot. And yeah, you know, the various aspects, like, yeah, it looks just like it did back then. You know, I did not live through it, but I have seen images and heard descriptions and such, including from descriptions from people who did live through it. So the level of detail, I suppose I've already somewhat covered. It definitely did. I do appreciate it did more than some others. You know, yeah, it makes it completely clear how much of a purposeful political act this was. That it was not just, yeah. And yeah, the dialogue is written and delivered quite well. You get a sense of who the various characters are. You know, the movie's maybe 92 minutes before end credits start, so it does have some limitation there. You know, it's not quite an ensemble cast. There is very much like she is the protagonist, and you have a number of major characters and some supporting characters. But considering how many characters we do meet, yeah, they manage to give us a sense of who everyone is. And yeah, this was directed by a black woman, which obviously helps tremendously with the authenticity. It has a very clear voice and does not feel like it is trying to explain it to people who just don't know anything at all about it. It does, you know, there are aspects where it is toned down. It is less radical than, you know, the actual story lends itself to. The the reality was, but one of the issues here, and I hate that this is something that, you know, some people are going to think this reflects poorly on the people who worked on it, and that feels incredibly unfair. To this day, America is a white supremacist nation. That is being made essentially impossible to deny at this point by the actions of ICE and the various policies of Trump. And in order for this movie to even get made, for it to have any chance of mainstream, you know, they had to tone certain things down. And I really admire how much effort they clearly put in and how much it paid off, that it does still focus so much on this political issue that, you know, I mean, yeah, in 2002 we were more, there was a sense that you could maybe talk about something like this. And then today, you know, you have all this anti-DEI crap where they eliminated an African American soldier's military record from I think what is a government website. I'm afraid my wrists are too sore to double check right now, but I believe that was what it was, because they were like, oh, you know, this is just preaching DEI. I mean, if what you mean by DEI is that they are not inferior to us white people, I don't know. I guess that is what the military record does show. I feel like your issue is with the people who wanted African Americans to be soldiers, because they were not treated equally. They were... I'm not the best person to talk about this, but please look it up if you don't already know. It's yeah, So the cinematography definitely does show its budgetary limitations. There's one particular shot where they are trying to show the scope of something, and I'll talk about it in detail in the thoughts section, but basically it seems like that would have been a fantastic place to have a pan or maybe a dolly, and instead it's essentially a wide shot, and it you know, it works okay, but yeah, but it's never like less than competent. It's simply not like visually spectacular, but it gets the job done. The editing does, there are a number of flashbacks that do feel like they are, it's important for them to show all this unfairness, and one in particular works really, really well, where, yeah, it's not a spoiler to say. Basically, Rosa is witnessing someone from her community, an African American, go through something that is, you know, not the most dignified, and she thinks back to how that was also the case when she was a child. And so things have not changed in decades of time. That worked really well. And then there are some where I think it also is in part the age rating issue. Some of them just don't hit quite as hard as they should. The Yeah, it's I think that's as much as I can say without spoiling anything. And the and oh, right, to be clear, so I am trying to check my white privilege here. I'm not saying that, obviously, I want to make it absolutely clear. I am aware this movie was not made for me. I am not judging it based on how, like, for me as a white person, I'm trying to compare it to. An example might be, I found that the various flashbacks in Spike Lee's He Got Game hit harder, for example. I was more deeply affected by Get Out and Us, you know. And those are, like, Spike Lee and Jordan Peele are amazing filmmakers. I'm not saying that that is not also the case for the director of this movie. Part of it is definitely the budget. Those movies were not as limited by that as this. But the production value is overall pretty good, at the very least, considering the circumstance, the budget, and TV movie status. But one of the things that works well is that certain things are shown through archival footage instead of them trying to recreate it. And it has the dual effect of saving the production money so that they can spend it elsewhere, because there are things here that clearly did cost some money, and the certain complicated things, and also at times just the number of extras who all had to wear period accurate costumes and the like. But in addition, it underlines this actually happened. This is not fiction. Like, it is somewhat fictionalized, but the core of what is being shown here, that actually happened. But yeah, the set design, locations, costumes, and makeup all you know, completely authentic and convey things about the characters. We might see where someone works, how they decorate their home, stuff like that. And the music is moving without ending up maudlin. And let's see. Yeah, there's some quite good elements to the sound design. There are times where you'll hear characters, you get a sense of the situation based on hearing, what are mostly dubbed in lines. And yeah, that works quite well. I thought this did a pretty good job of having the characters very humanized. Like, it does not act like, nobody here is perfect. There are some who come across as just, like, basically evil, and that is, of course, reflective of the fact that bigotry leads to evil. But I really appreciated that, yeah, it's not acting like, as a quick example, Rosa herself is shown not as essentially like a Christ figure, but a human being who just felt strongly that she had to do the right thing. And the people around her, some support her, some talk about how dangerous it is. And with a lot of conversations, it does get across, like, it does have a certain educational element to it. It's simply not, it's essentially like the early lessons, not the final exam. Yeah, as mentioned, it encourages further study, and it seeks to get us emotionally involved, and I would argue it accomplishes that. Now, as far as the acting goes, Angela Bassett, I can't put into words how happy I am that she not only, she's acted for decades and she's still acting and she's still knocking it out the park. I was so emotionally engaged watching the Black Panther movies, and no, those were not the first time I saw her and the various other, I was familiar with a chunk of that cast already. I'm not that much of a stereotype, but yeah, and she's one of the very best in Strange Days, and she's given a lot. Like, she has to carry a lot in that role. Honestly, even Green Lantern, she outshines actors who are as, perhaps even sometimes more, recognizable, more household names, who have more screen time than her. I mean, that is a movie where so many major characters are played by, like, people who have been nominated, maybe even won awards, people who are incredible actors. And also Ryan Reynolds. I kid. I hear he's good in at least some of the stuff that I haven't seen him in. I do also want to note the various white actors playing, incredibly racist, awful people. They really nail it. Yeah. And I think that might cover. Yeah, so yeah, the pacing is a tiny bit uneven. You know, part of it is the fact that it shows like a couple of very short scenes from Rosa's childhood. And I appreciate that they set up relationships and themes. But the fact that they are so very short, you know, it does, yeah, make it feel a little bit, yeah, it's not ideal. You know, I think part of it was that they, you know, I don't know if more was filmed and just left on the editing room floor. I appreciate that TV movies, a lot of them, they try not to go, like, get really, really long and such. And also, I think they wanted to get to, you know, Angela Bassett as soon as possible, which is understandable. I did want to note, honestly, even the kids are not half bad. The Yeah, the acting is consistently great throughout this. And let's see, I think that does bring us to the age rating. So Jim Crow was still a very violent time. This is something that a number of racist and apologists for such, you know, don't really like when we bring up, but it was that, you know, it was definitely necessary to do something about it. You know, the Civil Rights Act really was, like, it shouldn't have been necessary, but without it, the kind of treatment that black people faced, yeah, it was completely, they were truly dehumanized and, yeah, second class citizens, you know, not unlike Palestinians in the Gaza Strip today. And that is something that the movie does not directly bring up, but, you know, BDS uses similar methods as some of, you know, yeah, the NAACPs. Yeah. But yes, it definitely, so I want to choose my words very carefully. I want to make it clear. I am not saying that movies about black people have to show black people in pain. I do think it works well that this movie does show some very happy moments also for Rosa and others. It's essentially, you know, saying here was someone who, you know, when people weren't abusive to her, she was happy. She worked hard. She, you know, loved her family. Like, she was a person. With that said, I do think it loses something on how it, on account of the rating, is only allowed, and again, you know, white supremacy, it can only really bring up and not particularly detail, you know, the worst aspects of, I'm not saying there were any good aspects, but the most violent aspects, is perhaps how I should phrase it, of Jim Crow and, you know, racism in America even before Jim Crow, during slavery and such. And it is, you know, there is mention of, you know, hey, slavery wasn't that long ago, when, you know, for the events of the film, I mean. Now, I think that does cover, yeah. Um, This is overall a 7 out of 10 that comes very close to an 8 out of 10. And we are going to get into the thoughts section. So once again, from here on out, I'm spoiling absolutely everything about this movie. I thought that anchoring it with the love story between Rosa and Raymond, it struck a reasonable balance between the, because it's in part this thing of like trying to make it more palatable to an audience, but at the same time, yeah, you know, Rosa, there were good things in her life. The problem was, you know, Jim Crow and all these, you know, white people benefiting off it. And let's see, I think that, yeah, I'm gonna get into, so more or less scene by scene. So as mentioned in the spoiler-free review, you know, it speed runs through the childhood, and it is one of those things of Hollywood loves this thing of like having, you know, a child, you know, express something that is going to be a big part of that character's life for the rest of their life. I do think they handled the scene better than a lot would have. In general, you know, yeah, as mentioned in the review, you know, they're careful to not let it become maudlin of a movie. You know, Rosa, like, what she did was truly amazing. But we don't really need something that's just, like, worshiping her for it. I'm not saying she doesn't deserve that, but it's more compelling to have, you know, yeah, to show she was a human being, because we can all aspire to do what Rosa did. We can't really, you know, no one can be like an actual, you know, yeah, I mean, as mentioned earlier, you know, I said they didn't turn her into a Christ figure. We can't, we can try to follow the positives of, you know, I'm not Christian myself, but, you know, I do really appreciate, you know, the idea of loving one's neighbor, for example. But no one can be what Christ is claimed by a number of Christians, at least, to be, to have been, and to be again, I guess. But a human being, that's something we can we can aspire to be, to yeah. And the let's see, I think that does cover the but yeah, you know, I do appreciate, you know, just seeing her as a child, you know, making friends, you know, meeting Johnny, and, you know, later working at the NAACP, you know, in part, you know, yeah, meeting the others there, and Johnny works there, and this whole thing. And yeah, you know, the we have the, right, I do think the contrast works of, you know, as a child, she stands up in front of the class and says, we are all equal, we have to, you know, we can't let anyone, you know, well, let's see, the quote about, they can take away everything else, even our lives, but never our dignity. And, you know, first it's contrasted against the more cynical, you know, other student who points out the sad truth that, yeah, back then, you know, a lot of black women were not able to get more, their jobs were limited, as she points out. And later in the movie, Rosa herself, she still wants to do the right thing to make the world a better place. And, it's worth noting, when the world is made a better place for minorities, that doesn't make it worse for those of us in the majority. The world is much better for all of us. That shouldn't be necessary for, us white people to support non-white people, but for some it is, so there you go. And I think that does bring us to, so the entire courting, it does very much feel like the kind of love story you would have back then, where he's very persistent. And I do think they do an effective job of making it clear it's not necessarily that she doesn't want to be with him. She's just like shy or nervous about it, and his persistence leads to, because once they actually do start, once, let's see, they go fishing, and that, he's like, well, I didn't bring a bathing suit, and she's like, no, I want to fish. They are doing something together that she wants to do, and she's talking about, her grandfather and things like that. She's not some shy violet who's just like letting him boss her around. And I'm not saying that as something on black men. I'm saying that as a thing on straight men. I think that does bring us to, and he's introduced quoting an African-American poet and talking about how important it is that they defend, these, and there's even a character who comes right out and says, it's obvious they're innocent. These black people did not rape, and the, he has a bit of a scare, and for a while after that, he is more reticent to be active within it. And that is something that there are a number of African Americans and other minority communities. It is scary. And I thought the movie did a really good job of not judging him, because that's also important. It's not about how, like, it's very important that we don't take away from it that he, like, it feels weird to even say it out loud, but he was not weak. He was understandably scared. People were being killed for political activity and less than that. And the I think that brings us nicely to the the relationship between the two of them and the political issues are the two most consistent throughout the movie. Various characters will kind of come and go as their importance to the events waxes and wanes, but that remains. Neither of them ever really want to lose the other, and she never stops caring about the politics. He goes through the transformation. Early on, he's passionate about it and putting himself at risk, and then for a while he's more cautious, and then by the end he says he's really happy that she's doing this. And showing the wedding, like, it goes by fairly fast in the movie, but showing someone happy on their wedding day, that can have a very powerful humanizing effect. I think that is when the right. I appreciated the detail that as soon as the white owner of the barber shop walks in, everyone stops talking about civil rights for black people. You know, one of the patrons sees, oh, he's coming, and like clears his throat or fakes a cough, something along those lines, to let the rest of them know that yeah. And yeah, it's depressing but true. Sometimes people don't get justice because they can't themselves afford a lawyer. And, you know, sometimes it can be accomplished by donations. And that is one thing where, you know, there's a lot of bad about the internet and social media, but there are situations where, you know, a lot of people donated to someone, an individual or group, to fight for the right cause. I think that does bring us to, yeah, it's obviously very, very scary when you get the newspaper headline. And yeah, of course, Rosa, and we immediately think that Raymond was among them, and he shows up, and you know, yeah, understandably, very, very shaken up. And yeah, I really feel like it's one of those things when you're making an American movie for an American audience, if you don't want the audience to come away thinking a certain character is a coward, you have to be very careful in how you depict them pulling away from something that they feel deep down they should be doing. And yeah, they clearly took efforts to do that with Raymond. And let's see, I think that covers... So yeah, you have the part where she goes to the NAACP and talks to Johnny, and you know, it is genuinely kind of sweet, this thing of like, you know, this meeting is for members only. You are a member in high standing now, you know, and yeah, you know, she's hired as a secretary, and there's the thing about like, you know, I'm okay with being a secretary, but I don't want you to think that that's all I can do. And he's like, well, you know, what else can you do? And she's like, name it. Maybe I won't be able to do it, but I'll let you know. But you have to tell me, you know, and yeah, like that kind of fire is so inspiring to see someone just really going for. And that again is part of why they were able to make this movie, is of course America loves stories like that where someone sees what they want and just goes for it. And I will you know, acknowledge that the movie does kind of bend over backwards to say that Rosa, you know, it's getting a tiny bit close to the perfect victim narrative kind of thing, which we got to be careful about because there is no such thing as a perfect victim. And if we insist, oh, this person is a perfect victim, then people who need them to be a perfect victim will manage to find something, because there's always something, and they'll point to that and say, see, they're not a perfect victim. Maybe they're not a victim at all. And suddenly, you know, you've lost their support. So we have to underline, perfect victims don't exist. We shouldn't need someone to be a perfect victim. We can sympathize with someone who is just a victim. We can acknowledge that someone is not perfect and still empathize with them. And yeah, but I do think, you know, I quite appreciated that, yeah, you know, we meet some of the NAACP, you know, leadership and the most, you know, listened to voices and such, you know, and we meet just regular African Americans of various ages and hear their perspective on it. You know, that is crucial. And the way that it showed, they weren't completely unified, at least not at first, but after a while, yeah, it became clear to people, hey, we have to do this if we're ever going to be treated equally in America. And I think that does... Yeah, and it was great seeing, she becomes an inspirational teacher, just like she had one when she was a kid, and that's also where showing her as a child, at least briefly, also really benefits the overall film. I think that pretty much gets us to... Let's see. So we have that. Yeah, so, there's the first time with her on the bus, and, she is very reluctant and does end up, leaving the bus, and, it's very obvious that the bus driver purposefully catches her umbrella in the door, and, drops it, just a little bit further, so it ends up on the ground, and it's of course completely messed up by having been stuck in the door like that. And that's one of those things I distinctly remember. That's one of those images that I never forgot in 20 years, because it's such an easy to understand distillation of unfairness. She was already leaving. He had no reason to do that. He just did it to show that he has power over her, which he already did by kicking her out. It's that thing of, like, he's telling her, you should know your place. You should know you are not as good as someone who is white, which is such an absurd idea. And the let's see, yeah, and so she has to walk home, and Raymond and her mom help to take care of her afterwards. And yeah, again, like, this thing of this balance where, like, clearly Raymond does care, but he's also worried that she is going to get hurt if she does things like this. Let's see, I think that might get us to the... Let's see. Yeah, I mean, there was that flashback to the, swapping around the signs, and it is, like, it is obviously compelling, and it's true. I right now don't remember if it was something that happened to Rosa Parks specifically, but I have heard of, yeah, white people would have their dogs drink water out of the... I don't even want to say that word, but the fountain that was not... Yeah, that was for people who were not white, and yeah. Let's see, there's the... Yeah, she finds out about the young guy who is... the young man who has been arrested, and they're going to try to get him fried in the electric chair, and the guards just can't wait to see it. And yeah, this kind of thing did happen. Yeah. For a while, let's see, he said that he's known the girl since they were kids, and, yeah, eventually they, yeah, he was spotted through the window by a neighbor in the bedroom, and she did the one of those things that is part of why, a number of people don't have the highest opinion of not necessarily all, but a number of white women, and it is sadly true. Like, again, I'm not saying it to be misogynistic. I love women, but it is important when discussing racism in countries like America to acknowledge there were white women who ruined and sometimes ended the lives of black men through lies about, for example, assault of various kinds. And that doesn't mean you should not, you know, let's see. I quite appreciate the wording of believe women. It does not mean that if something has been like demonstrated to not be true, that you still somehow believe it, but start by listening to her and, believing it. It should be investigated. And yeah, the fact that it's a powerful moment for her to be looking right into his eyes and facing, because yeah, she already, as Raymond points out, we already knew about all this unfairness, and she points out it's different when you're looking directly into their eyes. And yeah, I like little things about their relationship, her bringing him, was it apple pie or something, to convince him to let her go to the, well, there's the thing about, she doesn't need his permission, but she would like his approval. And, when he's being difficult, she turns on her side in the bed and takes away the pillow, to very clearly demonstrate. A lot of women are told they cannot verbally disagree with men. And so, that's a way to very directly communicate it without it being verbal. I think that might bring us to let's see. Yes, so the bus again, and you have the thing about, she says she'll never forget the bus driver's face, and there's, yeah, but yeah, so she does not get out of the seat, and there's a seat right next to her. If this white guy, didn't, if he could handle for just one single bus ride to be sitting next to a black person, there wouldn't have been a problem at all. But no, he, it's that twisted notion where they actually thought that black people were less than human and would, like, infect them with something. And we're supposed to believe that non-white people are worse than bigotry towards non-white people, than racism. It's just completely ridiculous. And yeah, the movie's very careful to show, she doesn't raise her voice, she doesn't do anything physical, she doesn't threaten anyone. And that is, of course, also part of why, the yeah. So I think I've made it clear by now. I wholeheartedly support Rosa Parks. I have tremendous admiration for her. So it's not taking anything away from her and her legacy when I point out, and again, I'm quoting African American, leftist YouTubers here. She was not the only person who didn't give up her seat. Some of the others were deemed less, they were deemed more controversial than her, and the movie brings up, hey, there, here's all these, black people who are arrested for not giving up their seat. The I've heard people who thought that that Rosa Parks was the first black person who ever did not give up their seat. And it's, we have to be careful not to take away from, because acts of defiance like that, again, you should not have to be a perfect victim for that to be respected. Like, it is such an absurd thing for someone to have to give up their seat for someone who's just supposed to be like more worthy. It's just, yeah. And yeah, I thought they did a good job giving weight to it. He stops the bus, he goes over and calls and insists, no, I already tried, she will not leave the bus. And then being told, yes, you are allowed to arrest her. It is legal for you to treat her like a second-class citizen because she's not following this rule that is like genuinely just there to make them feel less than. Like, there's no reason for it. I think but yeah, and the two scenes of her on the bus, the first time where she's reluctant and the second time where she just consistently refuses to give up her seat. The little dubbed in lines with people saying, oh, just get up, oh, what are you doing, the things like that works well to convey, to give a sense of it. And for some of it, we'll see Angela Bassett's face as we're hearing this, as she's hearing this, and we're seeing she's not budging the second time, especially. And let's see, I think that does bring us to, yeah, and she's arrested and they won't give her a phone call, which again, that's like, you're guaranteed by law one phone call when you are arrested in America, and she's not given it. And let's see, I think that pretty much, yeah. And so yeah, you have the thing about the phone call to the well, let's see, first it's let's see, was I'm afraid I forget, it was like the let's see, there was the I'll have it momentarily. This I must look up. Yes. So yeah, Nixon goes to E.D. Nixon goes to the to Rose's mom's place, and they they talk about it, and Raymond insists you're gonna talk to them and get her released, and the guy actually hangs up, like, just completely ridiculous. But yeah, as soon as he realizes, oh, this is one black person looking out for another black person, I'm the law here, I'm not obligated to treat black people as equal. And yeah, they so they call the lawyer, and I really appreciate that this is a movie, I am not of the opinion that you have to have a good white person in a movie like this. Right now, I forget if it is historically accurate or not. You can look that up yourself. What I really wanted to say was, they don't let the good white people in the movie take over. It does not become a white savior narrative, which I really appreciate. Like, you could so easily, like, holy crap, this movie, can you imagine if it had, if that white lawyer had been the point of view character, And he just like hears about this black woman, and oh, I should definitely support her. And he like goes to her and tells her, you know what? If you refuse to give up your seat, I could defend you. And I was, yeah. And if you think that's too ridiculous of a thing, just keep in mind the movie The Help actually exists. That is not a fever dream. I hope I didn't, you know, bring up horrible memories of having seen that and trying desperately to just imagine. It was a horrible, horrible nightmare. But yeah, the let's see. We have the oh right. I also did want to talk about so the part where she gets the right to vote, and she takes the test 3 times, and that third time, she has she made a copy of the questions and the answers, and she's like, if you don't give it to me now, I'll have to get a lawyer to explain what I got wrong. And suddenly, you passed. Because for so many of these racists, bigots of various kinds, if they are not threatened with any kind of consequence, yeah, they just will not do the right thing. Like this, it's literally, yeah, she is legally allowed to get the voting. Yeah, and they're at the start, like she assumes that she can catch Rosa. She's like, how many states are there? How many senators are there? Which, like, why would you assume someone trying to be able to vote wouldn't do at least a tiny little bit of research first? And we see how this woman treats the white guy. It's like, oh, finally you came in. Oh yeah, well, it's just 150. Meanwhile, Rosa has to pay 12, and he doesn't have to fill out this test. He just gets it. They hand it over like it's candy, like it's nothing. And I think that does cover the let's see. Yeah, I also wanted to briefly comment on, so we do, the movie does indeed feature MLK Jr., who, if you've never heard one of his speeches, you are like, you truly have no idea what you're missing. And it's so screwed up that a bunch of white conservatives are trying to claim him and say, oh, he talked about, oh, content of character, not color of skin. Yeah, but that's not what he meant, though. He didn't mean, people of color should really get over what white people have done to them, because, content of the character. So I did really appreciate that we do get one of his, yeah, one of his speeches here, and yeah, and so let's see. I want to get this 100% right, so I'm just real quick gonna find. Yes, um, Dexter King, the third born child of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, plays his own father in this movie. And there are let's see, right. I'll go ahead and this is the second TV movie about the civil rights movement that depicts MLK that has one of his children playing a role in it. The first was 1999's Selma, Lord Selma, in which the King's firstborn child, Yolanda King, played a small role. And that movie, Martin Luther King Jr., was depicted by Clifton Powell. But yeah, I really appreciate that the movie does not let that become the entire focus, because that's another, Martin Luther King Jr. was a hero. You know, I don't think there's really any lesser word does it justice, and it was truly tragic that he was killed. And yeah, I can't say enough good words about him. But it is important to also underline he was not the only important figure in the civil rights movement, and some of the most important figures were Black women. You know, it's crucial to not take that away from them. The stories of minorities are so frequently overlooked and told improperly, things like that. And yeah, it's yeah, and just yeah, the scene in the church of the sermon, and seeing, you know, Angela Bassett sit there, and I don't even know if she particularly had to like act. I think that's just like the face of a Black person passionate about civil rights listening to Dr. King, you know. About 20 years ago. Oh, hold on. Mixing up my... No. 15... Around 15 years ago, I was taking English at a college-ish level, and the teacher played a, you know, a chunk of one of his speeches, and a room full of young people who frequently were not particularly, you know, attentive. There was not a sound made by any one of them. You could have heard a pin drop. And I think that does... Yeah, so then we have, you know, the meeting at the NAACP, and this discussion, and yeah, you know, it brings up how protest movements, and also just the fact that, you know, there's even the line, you know, a boycott is illegal. Think about that. Illegal. A boycott. That's just a democratic action. But yeah, you know, because they didn't really want, you know, that's something that, you know, it's becoming increasingly clear. There is a certain percentage of Republicans who just don't want democracy. Like, they go along with it, or they went along with it until recently because they thought it was the only way they could get power. And, you know, then MAGA came along and they felt like, okay, we can get away with pretty much anything. If you haven't read the most recent releases from the Epstein files, I don't know. Only do it if you feel confident you're not going to throw up. But yeah, I don't know if there's going to be justice when it comes to the victims of Epstein. I certainly hope that it is something that becomes such... I hope that in the future it won't happen, or at the very, very least, significantly less. I think there is some chance that the only way that will happen is for us to keep focusing on it until, you know, more is done. It has to become such a problem for the people who did it, these rapists, pedophiles, that they simply, you know, in the future, people will be too scared to engage in such behavior. I've said it before, it bears repeating. If you find yourself having urges that deep down you know you should not give into, instead of giving into them, see if you can find someone who can talk. Yeah, like, some people are helped by therapy. It's not easy, but it's better than becoming a rapist. And I think that might bring us to... But yeah, I thought the entire NAACP, the discussion about, there's that thing about, well, is enough people going to do it that it matters? How long are we going to do it? Would this even work? These kinds of things. And, we see several African Americans waiting for the bus. And, there's that line about, well, I guess we can't expect everyone to work, to go along with this. And when the door opens, this black woman says, I'm not getting on that bus until Jim Crow gets off it. And yeah, that's one of those things that's even more powerful than not standing there at all. Like, that's saying, you could have my business. This is America. We're a capitalist nation. That's something else I hope will change in the future. You lost yourself customers by, insisting on this law. And I think that's the part where we see, so we have the Rosa remembers as a child seeing a black person who was hanged. And of course, this is exactly the intended purpose of a lynching. It is to intimidate the rest of that group. That's why it's public. That's why it's so brutal. That's another thing. Only do it if you feel confident that you're going to be emotionally okay afterwards. But if you don't already accept the truth that lynchings were absolutely horrible, then there is a lot of information online that can hopefully change your mind about that. And I think that might... Let's see. Yeah, we have the part where Raymond is, there's the... Right. We also, I wanted to highlight, I thought it was great that they actually came right out and said half the KKK are cops. And this is something that, again, you don't have to just take at face value. Do some research. Law enforcement in America attracts white supremacists because it is a way for them to get away with brutalizing innocent people of color. And yeah, take your time, spend as much time, look into as many cases as you would like. Look at cases of police brutality where the victim is a person of color. And yeah, if you look at it and you aren't trying to rearrange facts to support white supremacist narrative, you will see it is a huge problem. But yes, so Raymond, and he readies the gun, and the windows are boarded up, and we find out, her mom is not there because they're, yeah. And it's one of those things where, again, the dubbing, and I guess maybe also some other sound design there, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. And I think the fact that they focus so much on his anxiety works well. I don't know that it would have been more effective if we saw people out there, because it almost feels like a scene out of a horror movie, like a slasher movie or something. Just we're focusing on the person who's afraid and not seeing the threat, because it's very clearly established. Like, you don't watch the scene and wonder, like, what is he worried about? Like, it's abundantly clear. And he does end up pointing the gun at her because he thinks she's one of these, white supremacists. And yeah, it is indeed many, many times someone has ended up pointing a gun at someone they didn't mean to, and sadly a number of times they shot them because of just the fear. Yeah. Let's see. I think that does. Let's see. Yes, then we have so very close to the ending. We have the um yeah, Raymond is waiting for the carpool, and there's the thing about, well, it's never on time. And yeah, the young guy is saying, he would like to just take the bus. And yeah, it was really great that he's talking about, like, how he's tired of the boycott. And then the older black man says, I'm tired too. And at first the young guy thinks that they're in agreement, and then he points out that what he's tired of is the injustice. And by the end of the scene, the young guy is helping the older guy carry his stuff, and walking him home. And the reaction from the woman there and from Raymond is just great. And yeah, that is such an important moment, because when you have the Rosa Parks, the myth about, like, oh, she just was too physically tired and she didn't want to get up, and they made the yeah, acting like it was not a purposeful political act. It can encourage this individualist, culture that is very prevalent in America, and frankly just exists to propagandize, to get people who are poor or middle class to think that they have more in common with the rich than each other, and it's completely absurd. Okay, I think my phrasing there deserves further explanation. I am Danish, not American. Hence me not grouping myself as part of the poor or middle class Americans. But yeah, we see it's about community. They are coming together. They are, as a group, boycotting, and even the ones who are like, I don't know about this, ultimately come around and appreciate it. And sometimes a big old softy, it warms my heart when I see a young person doing something helpful for an older person. That is, yeah, it's something that should be encouraged. I'm not saying that the older generations are always right, but something like fighting injustice and having to carry something that yeah. So I mention this every so often when I bring up generational conflict. I don't think it's inherently always wrong. For sometimes we do need to hash out our differences with other generations. I'm a millennial myself, but instead of saying right, that dang dad was the one who pointed out, instead of saying okay boomer, we should say okay capitalist, because it was capitalists, it's not all boomers who ruined things. I think, but yeah, so that, that inspires Raymond, and he goes home, and they have the conversation, and yeah, he points out, that's you. That's the girl I fell in love with, and yeah, I do really appreciate that it is clear, that this is a story where he has to come around and appreciate this is necessary. It is dangerous, but it is also, it has to happen. It's not about, like, he's not the one who tells her that she has to do this. That is her own moral conviction. And I am very impressed by how strong an impression the grandfather leaves, even though, like, he's mentioned a few times and we see him for, I don't know, is it maybe 2 minutes of screen time, but it just really, yeah, it's so deeply impactful there. And right, also really appreciated with Raymond, when they talk about fishing, he talks about this experience that I understand many African Americans have seen some, yeah, not necessarily personally, but they know people personally who have seen it personally, that a number of light-skinned, sometimes white-passing black people, people of color in general, they wish that they really were white. They hate that they don't always pass, and take it out on people who, sometimes on people who never pass, and sometimes on, and or family members and such. And yeah, that is one thing I think works really well here. Essentially, every time a character is experiencing pain, past or present, it ties back into white supremacy and, sometimes slavery, sometimes Jim Crow, but that is what it's, yeah. Right, and also when Rosa is fired because, well, they can't have this political agitator working, and she points out, but this is the busiest time of year. It makes no sense to, yeah. And I think that was, let's see. So I understand that the ending, it was a 2002, different time. It's almost a quarter century ago. I feel old because I still remember certain things, at least from back then. But yeah, it did feel a tiny bit like liberal self-congratulatory BS of this thing of, the clip of Clinton, honoring Rosa. But I do also appreciate, that was a big deal. You know, um, can you even imagine Trump doing equivalent? Remember how mad they got at Obama when he pointed out that, you know, yeah, the let's see, I believe it was that um, if he had a son, it would look, that son might look like Trayvon Martin. And Republicans screamed that, oh, you're encouraging violence. No, that's what you're doing, but, with fascists, every accusation is a confession.